This, ladies and gentlemen, is a money tree. Today, we are going to ask and seek to answer the question, does money grow on trees? According to modern monetary theory, it does. Over the past month, I've read 2 books, The Bitcoin Standard and The Deficit Myth. These books are complete opposites of one another. One of them claims that the government spends far too much money, even money that it doesn't have, while the other claims that the government spends too little money. And in fact, the government can never run out of money. And yet, despite their differences, both of these books shared a common thread, and that's that the authors wanted what was best for everyone. They both envisioned a world in which humanity could live free from the fear of war, poverty, and other distresses. How then do we arrive in a place where 2 seemingly intelligent individuals who want to go to the same place, to the same destination, have completely different ways of arriving at that destination? Ever since our most recent economic crisis, governments around the world have been spending billions or even trillions of dollars trying to hold their economies together. And it's resulted in many people around the world wondering what the ultimate effect will be of all of this government spending. And rightfully so. It begs the question, who's going to pay for all of this? Many people will say that my generation is going to have to pay for all of this, or maybe even many generations in the future to come. So I became very concerned about all of this. I wanted to figure out what was actually going on here. So I decided to explore the various viewpoints out there to see if I could make sense of all of this. And today, I'd like to share some of that with you. Now, I have to warn you, some of the ideas I'm going to introduce to you today, you may find yourself very resistant to, very closed off to. This is completely normal. I was exactly the same way when I was first introduced to them as well. And that's because in today's video, I'm going to suggest that this book could quite possibly be one of the most important books that I have ever read. And there does, in fact, appear to be a deficit myth that is pervading much of the economic discourse today. And this deficit myth might actually mean that our economy functions in a very different way than most people perceive it to. So I would challenge you to approach this video with an open mind, think critically, not emotionally, and if nothing else, I would seriously encourage you to give this book a shot and read it for yourself so you can come to your own conclusions. I'll leave a link to it in the description down below. So like I said, I was initially very resistant to the ideas posed by the author of this book. Her name is Stephanie Kelton, and she's one of the foremost proponents of this theory called modern monetary theory. After all, I've spent basically the past year and a half diving deep into the world of Bitcoin, sound monetary systems, hard forms of money, the gold standard, Austrian economics, and many other things that are antithetical to modern monetary theory. Heck, I even have a good chunk of my portfolio invested in various cryptocurrencies. So I want you to understand that when I say that I think these ideas are very important, that I'm coming from a similar place as you most likely, a place where you're concerned about the levels of government spending and debt and potential inflation that we are seeing today. And while I remain very bullish on crypto, including Bitcoin especially, I think that Stephanie Kelton and the modern monetary theory proponents may be in fact some of the very few people who correctly perceive the way that monetary policy and fiscal policy actually works. And this has massive implications for everyday people like you and me. And today I would like to dive into some of those implications. Okay, so now to start things off here, I'm gonna start off with the core premise of MMT. And you should be sitting down for this because it sounds crazy. It sounds crazy what I'm about to say, but here it goes. The core premise of MMT is that government deficits are actually a good thing for society. A good thing. Now hang on there, hang on. I know your mind is probably throwing up rejections to this idea because it sounds wrong, it sounds crazy, but let me try and illustrate it to you in the way that it clicked for me. Okay, so here we have 2 glasses of water that are filled roughly equally. Now, each of these glasses is going to represent something. This glass is going to represent the government's finances, whereas this glass is going to represent the private sector's finances. Private sector meaning all the citizens of a particular country. So that's you, and me. So in a very basic sense, whenever the government spends money, it adds money to the private sector while depleting the amount of money that it has. And then when the government taxes, it takes money out of the private sector and adds to the money that it has while depleting the amount of money that the private sector has. In this way, the government manages its finances. So whenever you talk about the government trying to balance the budget or just talking about government budgeting in general, this is in a very basic sense how it actually works. Now I'm gonna get these glasses back to about equal and then we're gonna go further with this. All right, that looks more or less good to me. So now let's imagine that there's an imaginary line going across where the water level currently is on both glasses. Now anything above this line is going to represent a surplus. It's going to go into the positive territory. Anything below this line is going to represent a deficit. It's going to be the negative territory. So in order for a government to run a deficit, what would have to happen here? Well, the government would have to spend more money than they take out of the economy. So let's do that and see what happens here. These are not the ideal cups to pour. You can see them spilling everywhere. Okay, so we can definitely see that the government glass is in a deficit. It's in the negative territory. They've spent more than they've taken back in from the economy. And this is what a lot of people are afraid of. A lot of people really don't like these government deficits. But what has happened here on the other side of the equation? Our glass is in a surplus. Our glass has taken in more than it has lost. In other words, we've gained economically. Now, this is the other side of the equation that most people don't see, and this is the side that MMT is trying to point out. A government deficit means a private sector surplus. This mathematically has to be true. Wherever there's a deficit, there has to be an equal surplus somewhere else. This just has to be true. But most people don't see the surplus because they're too busy being afraid of the deficit. And being scared of the deficit makes sense for 2 reasons. The first being fears of inflation. But the good news is MMT actually puts inflation as kind of the core focus of the whole theory. In fact, the entire chapter 2 of the book is dedicated to how MMT views inflation and how it's very concerned about controlling it. Secondly, you may look at a deficit and think to yourself, well, if it's a deficit, then that means that the government spent more money than they had, right? So that means they went into debt. To us, debt sounds bad. It sounds like we're living beyond our means, buying things that we can't afford. And so it's through this lens that we also look at government spending. But this is a fundamental misunderstanding of government finances. And that's because there is a massive difference between a currency user and a currency issuer. Let me show you. A currency user is someone like you or me, somebody who has to use the currency of our country to be able to buy goods or services. So if I wanted to buy something from you, I would go here you go, here's my money, take it. Now imagine you took this money. Oh no, that's where all the water was from before. So now you've taken my now wet money. But let's imagine that was all the money I had. Now, what do I do? Well, now if I needed more money, I would have to go out into the world to find some way to earn it, or maybe I'd have to borrow some money and go into debt. But now, imagine that I am a currency issuer. A currency issuer is a country that has a high level of monetary sovereignty. Monetary sovereignty means that this country has a high degree of control over their own currency. Examples of this are countries like the United States, Canada, and Japan. Whereas countries with lower monetary sovereignty might be countries that are part of the European Union, who use the euro. And that's because they've given up a lot of their monetary sovereignty to be controlled by the European Central Bank. So if I'm a country like the United States, and for some reason I have Canadian dollars, let's just pretend this was an American dollar, and I wanted to buy something, I could go, here you go, take my money. So now I bought something. But let's say I wanted to buy more goods or services from you. But that was all the money I had at this time. Well, as a currency issuer, I do not have to go to my people to tax them or to borrow from them. I can simply do this. Fresh off the press. There you go. Now in reality, it would actually be done on a computer. There's the money printing that we talk about isn't exactly printing of bills per se. It's more done in computer databases. But this is a fact. Governments with a high degree of monetary sovereignty never have to go and find ways to earn more money. They can just create it themselves. So a currency user, like you and me, are fundamentally different from a currency issuer like a government. I know that might sound crazy, especially if you're one of my older viewers who lived through a period of time or near a period of time when the currency was still pegged to gold. But the fact of the matter is, this is how modern fiat currency works. Whether you agree with it or disagree with it, this is just how it works. The government can never run out of money because they are a currency issuer. So they can just create money out of thin air, which means that taxes do not actually fund government spending. This is a very important point. The government doesn't need to find a way to fund anything. That's because, again, they are a currency issuer and not a currency user. The main problem here around a lot of the economic discourse is that we look at government budgeting the same way that we look at household budgeting, when they're really completely different things. Now, I know you might be thinking, okay, perhaps this is in fact how modern fiat currency works, and this is how government budgeting actually works. But nonetheless, wouldn't this still cause some form of currency devaluation and inflation? This is my concern as well. While I did find that there was a lot addressed in this book, I would still love to speak with someone like Stephanie or someone else in the MMT community so that they can kind of help me walk through this a little bit further. However, I will say that I was very pleased to see in the book that MMT seems to place inflation as basically the core concern. It's like the thing they seem to be most concerned about when they're deciding how to actually enact a lot of the policies that are a part of this theory. But perhaps most of all, my biggest concern would be how this might impact our view of what money really is. I remember from a very young age, I could always see that money was just made up. It was just a social construct that we basically used as a glue to kind of hold society together and make sure that we could cooperate efficiently. But I don't think most people see it this way. I remember my papa used to think that he could just walk down the street to his local bank and he could ask the bank teller there to, "Hello, good sir, could you please show me my money in my vault? I would like to see it today." And he could go there and see it anytime, but that's obviously not the case. So part of me wonders, what would happen if this truth were to be widely understood, that government debt is basically a meaningless number that could be wiped out easily with the single stroke of a keyboard at the central bank? What would this revelation do to our collective understanding of what money really is? So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments down below, and I would also highly encourage you once again to check out the book The Deficit Myth by Stephanie Kelton. If nothing else, I think it's always a good idea to challenge your own beliefs and to try and maintain an honest intellectual curiosity, even with ideas that may make you feel uncomfortable. So this will be linked in the description down below. And with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.